So I want to start with basketball. As you are aware, we did have some big visitors that came in to this Alabama-Georgia game this last weekend. We had 3 visitors. We thought that there was going to be 4, but there ended up just being 3 in Caleb Holt, 2026 5-star, and AJ DeBanza and Braden Burries, 2025 5-stars. Out of this visit, we've really seen the most movement out of Braden Burries. We really like what we've seen out of there. We think, based on the reports, that we have made some movement in his potential recruitment. So that's one to really keep an eye on. That's one that the staff is kind of hot on the presses for. Hopefully going to try to land and just really stay on the lookout for that one. Out of the 3, out of this most recent visit, that is the recruit that we feel most confident in. In terms of Malik Thomas, that was originally scheduled to be visiting during this weekend, from what we've heard, his visit is potentially being pushed back until October the 12th, which is when the Final Four banner raising is going to be happening. And then AJ DeBanza, coming out of this, we've talked a lot about him, number 1 overall player. We like where we stand. However, just so that everyone is aware and so that I'm setting expectations properly, it really feels like this may be BYU's to lose. And the question, may be, hey, why is BYU, the one to lose? And the answer is simply NIL. There is a massive NIL deal on the table from BYU based on all reports that we have heard. Alabama is in the best position if it is not an NIL race. From everything that we've heard, his family and team really likes what Alabama did with Brandon Miller and has done with those wing position players and likes what they are able to do with him. He also has a really good relationship with Preston Murphy, who coached him for a few years while he was Expressions AAU. So it is a very familiarity with our staff and familiarity with the system. However, this may come down to a simple fact of BYU is offering more money than Alabama is going to pay the entire team this year. And if that ends up being the case, based on the numbers that I've heard, I don't know that I fully blame him. So if that ends up being the case and we do see AJ DeBanza head to BYU, just know that the staff has done everything in their power to get him into Tuscaloosa, and it may be too little to get him here. But obviously, us being that close and within striking distance of the number 1 player, probably the number 1 draft pick for next season, is a huge deal. Obviously, that speaks to the benefit and the pedigree of what Nate Oats has done. It speaks to how good a job Preston Murphy has done. It speaks to a job that Brian Adams and Ryan Pannone have done, with their NBA backgrounds and what people and scouts and agents and everyone thinks of Nate Oats' system, how it is an NBA system in the college game. That speaks to all of that. But like I said, in this case, don't get your hopes up. It is one that we're watching very closely, but it would, at this point, probably kind of shock me if we do end up landing him. Obviously, would love to see it. I just don't know if it's realistic or if it's going to happen. So we will have to keep an eye on that one. The other thing I want to talk about with this is Nate Oats actually did an interview podcast with John Rothstein. If you don't follow him, he's a huge basketball influencer over on Twitter. He's with CBS Sports. He does College Basketball Today podcast. He also calls some games and does some things during March Madness with CBS. But with this, John Rothstein interviewed Nate Oats, and Nate Oats kind of talked. John Rothstein asked him about a few different things. He obviously asked him, like, hey, what's the big difference in last year's team and this year's team? And Nate Oats goes, it's really just rim protection. That's the huge thing, obviously. We have some returners from last year's team. Nate talked about how he really likes the mix of returners, transfers, and new guys from a freshman standpoint. Nate Rothstein, asked about who he thought may take the biggest step forward this season, and Nate mentioned Jaron Stevenson as a name to watch. And the reason I also wanted to mention Jaron Stevenson is if you watch the episode for the preview of the Georgia game, you'll know that I mentioned that Nate had confirmed there was an injury to Chris Youngblood. And that injury to Chris Youngblood is going to have him out until probably through the entire month of November, and at some point in December he's going to be back. Nate was kind of saying, how early in December is the question. We heard some reports maybe around the UNC game But at some point, obviously, we're going to be able to get Chris Youngblood back. But the reason I mention this is Nate mentioned Jaron Stevenson as a potential candidate to play the 3 to start the season. And if that happens, then Alabama is going to be running out a lineup of Mark Sears, Latrell Wrightsell, Jaron Stevenson, Grant Nelson, Cliff Amore. So that's 3 guys, with Stevenson, Nelson, and Amore all at the 6'11", size frame, and that's just an absolutely massive starting lineup. If that is something that does happen, I would be very curious to see, how Jaron's defense is able to hold up. I think that because of his length, he would be able to stay in front of and, defend some quicker, smaller guys that he definitely would be going against, because in almost every position, I would assume, he's going to be bigger than who he's going up against, especially at the 3. So that is something definitely to watch out for. Like I said, something that Nate Oats mentioned as a possibility, and it does sound like he really likes the strides that Jaron has taken and talked about, because Jaron was a reclassification from the high school ranks. He was supposed to be in high school last season. This is a situation where Jaron's had time to put, weight on his body, which we saw the benefit of that in the Clemson game in the Elite Eight, versus how bad he played in the Clemson game earlier in the season, just to not having the body ready for it. So it's definitely something that we know that he has that ability to obviously work on his body and work on his game, but it really sounds like that's something he has done and has taken a big step forward. There was also a question that I wanted to mention about Nate Oats was asked about scheduling and like, hey, why don't you keep scheduling these murderers rows? And Nate, kind of simply said, at the end of the day, this season is not about us trying to have some perfect resume heading into SEC play, right? This is not about us going 13-0 in non-conference play, because going 13-0 may mean that you were not tested, right? If you go 13-0 and we're absolutely tested, then great, right? But if you go 13-0 and it's because you were not tested, then what's the point of that? And he said it really dates back to his days when he was at Romulus and everyone made it in the state tournament. So he would just schedule the hardest teams you could play, because if everybody's going to make it into the tournament, let's get our guys as battle tested as possible so that the thing we actually care about, that tournament, is fully ready. And that's kind of Nate Oats' philosophy when it comes to scheduling in the non-conference. That's right. The goal of the team is to win the regular season, win the SEC tournament, win the national tournament, right? Win the March Madness tournament. If that's your real goal, his idea is let's schedule as hard as possible in the non-conference, get our team as ready as possible, play as many different styles, as many types of offenses, as many types of big elite bigs, as many type of solid guards as we can possibly play, so that when we get to March Madness, we can call back on some of those games. Or when we get to SEC play, we can call back on some of those games. Obviously, if you've watched how Nate has scheduled here recently, that may have been obvious to you, but I just thought that it was, relatively important that he did mention it. And I thought that I had not heard him say, with the Romulus piece about everybody getting into the tournament, I thought that made complete sense to me. And then obviously, when John asked Nate what the biggest addition to this team is, we talked about defense, but it really kind of starts with Cliff Amore. Cliff, we made a video on it this offseason that he was possibly the biggest addition that Alabama basketball has had in quite some time, just due to what he brings to this team, especially with who's already returning. And you bring in a guy who blocked about 75% as many shots as Alabama did as a team last season. Alabama as a team had around 120 blocks. Cliff had over 90 blocks. So this is a situation where you're bringing in an absolute elite rim protector, and for what Nate Oats tries to do and the way he likes to funnel his defense, that's absolutely huge. But then also what it brings even from an offensive standpoint. And it's something that Nate mentioned, that Cliff's offense is a little bit further along than they were, I think, expecting at this point. He did mention that Cliff's probably not going to play as many minutes as he played at Rutgers, just due to the number of possessions that we play. He may play the same number of possessions, but not as many minutes, just due to how quick we play. And from a conditioning and size standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to play the big guy quite as many minutes. But that is something to kind of keep in mind. So that's what I wanted to talk about on the basketball front. Like I said, really wanted to talk about the recruiting coming out of that Alabama-Georgia game and what we've been hearing, and then wanted to talk about the Nate Oats interview that he did with John Rothstein. I will link it down in the show notes, so if you have not had a time to listen to it, I really would recommend it. These were some of the kind of key points that Nate talked about, but if you want to hear it out of his mouth, I'll link it down in the description.